Lady Nyra had always known luxury. The palace on Zithar, her home, stood atop a mountain of marble, its towering spires cutting through the sky like the fingers of the gods themselves. She had been raised as the daughter of Baron Valther, one of the most powerful men in the galaxy. Her life was filled with soft silks, gold-trimmed halls, and the finest food from across the stars. As the heir to her father's empire, Nyra had everything a young woman could want, but she had little understanding of the world beyond the palace gates. She had been kept far from the dangers and struggles of her father's rule. She had never needed to worry about anything. That was until the rebellion came. The empire that her father had built was not as stable as it seemed. For years, the people of Zithar had quietly resented the oppressive rule of the aristocracy. Baron Valther's grip on the throne had always been shaky, but he had kept it tight with fear, power, and violence. As the empire weakened, whispers of rebellion spread throughout the population, growing louder by the day. Soon, the people had had enough. Nyra had no idea how deep the rebellion ran until one fateful night. She was sitting in the grand hall, enjoying a quiet dinner, when the guards rushed in with urgent news. Her father's face was as cold as stone as he listened to the reports, his expression unreadable. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. "My lord," one of the guards said, breathless, "there are rebels in the lower levels of the city. They've taken the industrial zones. The military is overwhelmed." Baron Valther's hand tightened around the armrest of his throne. His eyes were fixed on the guard, but they were distant, as if he were looking at something far beyond the present. "We must act," he said, his voice low but filled with a dangerous calm. "Prepare the fleet." Nyra watched from her place at the table, her heart racing. The rebellion was closer than she had ever imagined. But what frightened her more than the rebellion itself was her father's reaction. She had always known he was ruthless, but now she saw the true extent of his cruelty. Her father stood, his eyes still cold, and turned to face her. "Nyra," he said, his tone commanding, "you must leave the palace immediately. Go to the safe house on the moon of Varus. It is the only place where you will be safe." Nyra's mouth went dry. "But, father, what's happening?" Baron Valther's gaze hardened. "Do not ask questions. Go, now." Confusion and fear rushed through Nyra as she stood up to obey. She had never seen her father act like this before. His commands had always been followed without question, but this was different. Something was wrong. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she said nothing as the guards escorted her from the room. It wasn't until she was on the shuttle, leaving the safety of the palace behind, that the full weight of her father's words hit her. The journey to the moon of Varus was long and silent, and the moment she arrived, she was met by a small group of her father's trusted advisors. They had brought no soldiers, no protection, only a small team to oversee her safety. "We're to stay here until further notice," one of the advisors said. "The Baron has ordered us to ensure your safety until the situation is resolved." Nyra was too numb to speak. The world she had known seemed to be falling apart around her. As the shuttle took off from the moon and flew into the vast emptiness of space, she began to realize how little she understood of her father's world. The luxurious life she had known had been nothing more than a thin veneer. Beneath it was a ruthless, unforgiving empire that could crumble in an instant. Weeks passed, and Nyra's fears were confirmed. News from Zithar had become sparse, but the whispers she received from the advisors were enough. The rebellion was spreading. The capital was in chaos, and her father's once proud empire was on the verge of collapse. One day, as Nyra walked through the empty halls of the safe house, she noticed a strange silence. The guards were gone. The advisors had left. The moon seemed deserted, and she could hear the hum of the engines as the shuttle prepared to take off again. But this time it wasn't for safety. The Baron had ordered her exile. It was a cold, calculated decision. Nyra had always been a symbol of her father's rule, a tool to secure his position. But now, as his empire teetered on the brink of destruction, she had become a liability. The rebellion would not only overthrow him, it would destroy everything he had built. He could not afford the risk of keeping his daughter alive. She was left with nothing. The shuttle took off, but instead of returning to the palace, it flew toward the desolate moon on the edge of the galaxy. Varus had been the site of a failed colony years ago, and it was considered uninhabitable. Yet that was where Naira was abandoned, left to die in the emptiness of space. Her father's betrayal cut deeper than any blade ever could. The man she had trusted had left her to perish. As the shuttle descended to the barren landscape, Naira couldn't help but feel the weight of her isolation. She had been cast out, not because of any fault of her own, but because her existence had become inconvenient. The knowledge gnawed at her. She had been raised to believe in her importance, but now she realized that she was nothing more than a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The shuttle landed with a heavy thud on the cracked surface of the moon. Naira was the last to exit, her legs shaky as she stepped onto the cold, dry ground. There was nothing here. No cities, no signs of life, just dust and stone. The wind howled through the craters, carrying with it the scent of nothingness. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked around. She was alone. For a moment, Naira wanted to give up. She could see no way out. The moon was a wasteland, and her father had given her no hope of survival. The silence of the place pressed down on her, and the cold seeped into her bones. She could feel the weight of her despair. But just as she was about to surrender to the darkness, she heard something. A sound that didn't belong. It was the soft hum of an engine. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Had someone come for her? She quickly moved toward the sound, her breath coming in short gasps as she stumbled across the jagged landscape. And then, emerging from the dust, she saw it. A small, sleek ship, its hull gleaming in the dim light of the distant stars. It was not one of her father's ships. This was something different. The ship landed softly in front of her, and the hatch opened with a hiss. From the shadows inside, a man stepped out. He was human. Commander Elias Storm had been exploring the far reaches of space when his ship's sensors had picked up the distress beacon from the abandoned moon. At first, he thought it was a malfunction, a glitch in the system. But as he traced the signal, he realized it was real. Someone was stranded out here. What he found was unexpected. Naira stood before him, weak and trembling, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She was nothing like the princesses he had read about in old stories. She was real. She was fragile, and she needed help. "Are you?" she began, her voice hoarse from lack of use. "Who are you?" Elias surveyed the woman in front of him. She was not just a helpless noblewoman. There was something in her eyes that spoke of untapped strength, a fire that had not yet been extinguished. "My name is Elias," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to help you." Naira stared at him for a long moment, unsure of whether she could trust him. She had been betrayed by her own blood. Could she trust this stranger? But there was something in his presence, something steady and sure, that made her feel like for the first time in weeks, she wasn't completely alone. Elias extended his hand. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. For the first time since her exile, Naira hesitated, but then she took his hand. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, it felt like there might be hope. The days that followed were slow and uncertain. Naira had never imagined that the worst thing she could experience would not be death, but the waiting. The stillness of the barren moon around her was suffocating. She had been so accustomed to the bustling activity of Zithar, where everything seemed to move with purpose, to the point where she never questioned her place in the world. But now, her life felt as though it had ground to a halt. She and Elias had found shelter in the wreckage of an ancient structure, half buried in the dust. It had once been a research station, but it was long abandoned. The walls were cracked and the air was thin, but at least it provided some protection from the elements. Elias had spent the first few days fixing the ship. ensuring that it was fully operational in case they needed to leave. But as the days passed, Naira couldn't help but feel a strange pull to stay. There was something here, in the silence, that made her feel connected to the world in a way she had never felt before. Elias, on the other hand, was always focused. He was a man on a mission, even if he didn't share all the details with her. Every day, he would leave to scout the area, looking for supplies or signs of life. He had already taught her how to hunt for food, to navigate the barren landscape, and to use the few tools they had to their advantage. Naira, though still uncertain of her place, tried her best to learn. It was her only way of coping with the isolation. She couldn't just sit there and wait to die. One morning, as Elias was preparing to leave for another expedition, Naira stood up to join him. She had grown accustomed to his company, and the thought of spending another day alone in the station was unbearable. "Elias," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of her request. "I want to come with you. I can help." Elias looked at her, his face unreadable. He hadn't expected her to ask. He had never meant for her to accompany him on his missions. She had no experience in survival, and he didn't want to put her in danger. But when he saw the determination in her eyes, he knew it was useless to argue. "You've been through enough already," he said, his voice softer than usual. "This is dangerous. You're not ready." Naira stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I don't care. I can do this." Elias hesitated, then sighed, realizing that arguing was pointless. Naira had never been one to take no for an answer. If he left her here, she would only grow restless. It was better to have her by his side, where he could keep an eye on her. "All right," he said, his voice gruff. "But stay close to me. This is no place for a novice." They set off together, the wind kicking up dust as they walked through the desolate landscape. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and barren, a dull gray expanse that stretched endlessly in every direction. Naira could barely remember what it felt like to walk on the lush, green hills of Zithar, or to smell the rich scents of the royal gardens. Here, the air was thin, and the only sound was the crunch of their footsteps on the dry earth. As they moved further from the station, Naira noticed how Elias moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the terrain, every step calculated. It was as though he was always prepared for something to go wrong, always on alert. She had never known anyone like him. He was unlike the people she had grown up with, people who lived their lives inside walls of gold, who never had to worry about where their next meal would come from or whether the ground beneath their feet might collapse at any moment. "Do you ever stop?" she asked, breaking the silence between them. Elias glanced over his shoulder at her. "Stop what?" "Worrying," she replied. "You're always on edge, like you're waiting for something terrible to happen." He was silent for a moment before speaking again. "I've seen a lot of terrible things. Sometimes it's hard to let go of that." Naira didn't fully understand what he meant, but she could see it in his eyes, the weight of years of experience, of battles fought, of lives lost. He carried it with him like a shadow that refused to fade. They continued walking in silence, the sun low in the sky. The landscape was empty, save for the occasional rock formation or twisted piece of metal half buried in the dust. The days here passed differently than they did back on Zithar. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly, without any real sense of direction or purpose. It was hard to believe that this barren moon had once been the site of a thriving colony. Now it was just a forgotten relic, like so many other places in the galaxy. After a few hours of walking, Elias stopped and crouched by a rock. He motioned for Naira to do the same. She dropped to the ground beside him, her eyes scanning the area. They had reached a small valley, and Elias was watching something in the distance. Naira followed his gaze and saw it, a small group of creatures moving across the plain. They were large, reptilian beasts with scaly skin and long, powerful tails. They seemed to be grazing, unaware of the two humans watching them. "They're dangerous," Elias whispered, his voice low. "Stay here and keep quiet." Naira nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen creatures like these before. Back on Zithar, animals had been tamed, docile, raised in controlled environments. Here, in the wilderness, there was nothing to protect her. Elias reached for his rifle, checking the ammunition before turning to her. "Stay low, I'm going to try to get us closer. We'll need food for the next few days." They crept forward, moving slowly, careful not to make a sound. Naira's heart was in her throat as they inched closer to the creatures. The air felt thick, as if the entire valley held its breath. Then, just as Elias was about to raise his weapon, one of the creatures turned its head, its eyes locking onto them. In an instant, the creature's body tensed, and it charged. Naira gasped, scrambling backward as Elias fired a shot, hitting the beast in the shoulder. It screeched, but it didn't stop. Instead, it turned and charged again, its massive form thundering toward them. Elias fired again, this time hitting the creature square in the chest. It collapsed with a heavy thud, but the ground shook with the impact. Naira was frozen, her mind racing. She had never experienced anything like this before. In an instant, she had gone from the sheltered daughter of a baron to someone fighting for survival in an alien world. "Are you okay?" Elias asked, his voice urgent. Naira nodded, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. She was shaken, but she didn't want to show weakness. "Not now." "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was tight. Elias didn't waste any time. He moved to the creature's body, inspecting the kill. "This will feed us for a while," he said, his voice matter of fact. "We'll need to get it back to the station before nightfall." They worked quickly, dragging the creature's body back to the shelter they had found earlier. The process was messy, and Naira found herself struggling to keep up with Elia's pace. But there was something about this moment that stirred something deep within her. The fear she had felt earlier had faded into something else, a sense of purpose. She wasn't helpless anymore. She was no longer the pampered daughter of a baron, waiting for someone to save her. She was learning how to survive. That night, as they sat around the fire, cooking the meat from the creature, Naira found herself talking to Elias in a way she never had before. They spoke of their lives, of their pasts, of the things they had lost. Naira had always been so focused on her own world, on the empire her father had built, but now she began to understand Elias' quiet pain. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who had been broken by the things he had seen, and he carried those scars with him every day. "I used to be like you," Naira said softly, staring into the fire. "I thought the world was something that could be controlled, that everything had its place. I never imagined that things could go wrong, that they could just fall apart." Elias didn't look at her but nodded. "Most people don't until it happens." There was a long silence between them. Naira didn't know what else to say, but she realized that she didn't need to speak. They both understood. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Elias taught Naira how to prepare food, how to use the weapons they had, and how to stay hidden in the wilds. She was no longer the scared, helpless girl who had been abandoned by her father. She was becoming someone else, someone stronger. And though Elias remained distant, never fully opening up to her, Naira could sense a change in him as well. He had come here expecting nothing but another lonely mission, but now he was beginning to see her not as a burden, but as an ally. They were both survivors now, and that bond, however unspoken, made them stronger. As the days stretched on, Naira knew there was no turning back. She had been abandoned by her father, left to die, but she was still alive. And she wasn't alone anymore. Together, she and Elias would find a way to survive this barren moon. And perhaps, in time, they would find a way to turn the tide of the rebellion that had taken so much from them both.